For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Mudley. Andrew Johnson joins me to discuss his co-edited book, Leadership, Perspectives from the Frontline. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
Can you briefly tell us what leadership is about?
I think the way that we would define leadership is to say, rather than it being all about theory, is to, if one were to speak of leadership as action, then you could say that such action could be effective or ineffective. And the way that we would define it then is to say that leadership is achieving your intended consequences. So, for example, if a leader were to say, I want to build a high-performing team, the extent to which it takes actions to achieve that and then actually achieve those results is the extent to which we can say that a leader has been effective. And I think, for me, that's probably the easiest way to define leadership. So I'm sure if you read lots of books, there will be as many definitions of leadership as there are books. But I think if one were to talk about it in a more simpler way in defining it as action, then I think we give also advice to people. How do you step up to the challenge of leadership?
What was the reason for compiling this book?
The publisher approached me just over 2 years ago, Knowledge Resources, and they had published a book previously, which was probably reaching the kind of 5-year term of the book, and he said, look, there's so much new things going on within the space of leadership and just the challenges that have changed quite dramatically within the space of the world itself. People also being faced with things like the fourth industrial revolution and all this exponential technological changes that were happening. How do leaders operate in that world now, given the fact that the challenges seem to have increased rather than decreased, but also became more complex in terms of how you have to deal with it. So did the book that they wrote previously around leadership, was it still responding to the challenges as we're experiencing it now? And he then said to us, he listened to a few of us talking about leadership at various conferences, and ask us to perhaps come up with a way of looking at leadership now within the current challenges as faced by leaders in various sectors of society, not just business, obviously.
And who are you targeting with this book?
We're targeting a number of different people, obviously executives within organizations, to be able to get various perspectives of how do they begin to step up to the challenge of leadership. There's sufficient number of different kind of perspectives on leadership in there, but in a way that it is not just theoretical, but it also gives the leaders some very concrete ways. How do you actually go about doing this within your business? And which of these different schools of thought around leadership most resonate with who I am as a person, because there's sufficient number of different perspectives in it. So clearly we're trying to target executives with theory-informed practices. And it's almost like creating this tension to say, it's not just practice for the sake of practice, or trying to say to somebody, if you follow these 5 rules, you'll be a great executive. And there's no substance to what we're talking about, the kind of stuff that you read often in the media. It's rather to say there's a solid body of knowledge that sits behind this that informs how do you actually do this thing in practice. And that was very much the intention of the book. But we're also targeting any academic in the space of leadership. We're doing, for example, academic peer reviews on the book so that it could be utilized in academic institutions. We have received 5 academic peer reviews in that regard. So academics could get credits in terms of acquiring such a book. Students on leadership, obviously, it's a kind of, we almost wanted to create a bit of a textbook that they could go to in terms of getting a whole variety of perspectives on leadership. but leaders beyond just the business world, because if you look at the book, it targets leadership in various sectors, whether that be business or the public sector or in political spheres or in schools, tertiary institutions also. We even have a section about community leadership. What does it mean for a leader to operate in the context of the challenges that the leader would face in a community environment? So a person who plays in a leadership role there, what are the potential issues that that person will face? And secondly, what would be the kind of competencies required for you to play effectively in such a space? So a whole variety of people playing kind of in a broad sense in leadership type of positions and in various contexts.
What was the research required for this book?
I think we obviously depended quite a lot on the experts who wrote the various chapters within the book, including ourselves, to come with their own particular research and theory in that space. So, for example, there is a chapter on neuroscience, so we would have gone out and looked for the person who best express a very solid base of knowledge within the space of neuroscience, and also have manifested very good practices with regard to neuroscience helping leaders to operate more effectively. Obviously, we'd had to look very carefully, because inevitably, if you look at something new like neuroscience, it's quite likely with new things, a lot of fads develop around the thing, and so you have to kind of work out what is exactly, like just sales speak around this thing, or what is really solid knowledge that could inform practice for people. And that's what we try to do. I obviously, having worked in many corporates, had exposure to a whole range of people who obviously were selling products to us in various organizations that I've worked. So I had a good sense of the market. Where are the really solid people in terms of what they are, potentially selling in terms of a service or product? And we went for those kind of people. Theo Veldsman, who partnered with me on editing the book, he also had a range of people that he knew quite strongly within the academic sphere and perhaps also the consulting space to be able to give advice. Who should we be targeting with regard to the book?
Former Public Protector Thuli Mandonsela wrote the foreword for the book. Why was she chosen for this?
I think we were keen to have somebody almost give a little bit of context to the whole leadership challenge, and choosing somebody that I think very few South Africans, if not international commentators, would disagree that Thuli for us expressed perhaps the strongest sense of the type of leadership we're looking for. Somebody who can speak with courage in a situation where it's probably very difficult for people to speak out because fear of victimization and all sort of things that could happen to you, whether that be in the public sphere or even in organizations. Somebody who had a very strong sense of this integrity that we all say is a very critical part of what a leader should be about, Somebody who was able to address the issue not in a way of fighting about it, but stating a truth very quietly but firmly as to what is the issue that we're dealing with here, and certainly taking on some very powerful people in that regard, and without considering the consequences or something like that, but still to be able to stand up and speak to it. And we felt that in terms of kind of framing the whole sense of the book, we had to go for somebody who expressed most what would be the desirable kind of characteristics we would look for in a leader. And that's why we went for it was not an easy task, I must confess to you that it took, we approached when she wrote the actual piece, we approached almost a year before. And just how busy she was, to actually get down and write a piece, but we got it eventually from her. And that certainly gave a sense of what was it that we were trying to almost manifest a little bit in the book, the characteristics of a leader. And here people were looking at somebody who manifested those behaviors, not just talk about it. So a person could say, when we talk about leadership, how you kind of think about this type of person. We had others, obviously, that we could have approached. There was also the Arch. It's the kind of person that comes to mind, like Thuli Mandonsela, that expresses that kind of fearless courage, to speak truth to power.
There are also leadership stories in the book.
Sure.
Can you tell us who some of the contributors were and what the subject topics were?
We chose quite a number of leaders. We didn't want to confine ourselves only to business leaders. So you will see quite a few of them are from big corporates. I think about, for example, Joseph, who is CEO of Vodacom. They were the 3 founders of First Rand, and people like that. So we had a few business leaders talking, even Herman Mashaba, who is now the executive mayor of Johannesburg. So we approached business leaders, but we wanted to get a variety of perspectives. So you will also see people who had kind of a combination of political leadership and business leadership. Some people that come to mind is Cheryl Carolus, for example, or even Jill Marcus, who had experience both in the private sector, the political, and also kind of semi-state institutions like the Reserve Bank. So a whole variety of experiences that came through in that particular instance. Some people also wrote from a kind of African perspective in that particular context as to how they see leaders. And that's what we were trying to do within that particular section, but with a way of a leader telling his or her story rather than us circumscribing how the story should be told. The reason why that is important is leaders ultimately, in whatever organization you find yourself, fundamentally they're trying to create meaning for their people in terms of how do we see our business, how do we rally around it, and where are we going with this particular thing. You can't just tell that in cold documents. You must actually be able to tell. It's almost like creating this vision for your people. Vision is not a cold kind of document or a statement that you read somewhere. It's somebody explaining, this is where I want us to go together. And it's in that sense that the leader needs to be able to tell the story about where you're going. In that sense, create meaning for people. Human life, I think, is very much about meaning making. And I think for a long time, leaders didn't see just how critical that was for people within organizations to create this one meaning and story which is about their particular organization. And that's what we try to do with the variety of leaders who wrote their particular stories.
And what do you hope people will take away after reading this book?
One should hope that, if nothing else, first of all, to understand that leadership is a very difficult space to play in. You have to, it's in many instances a very lonely space, which means you have to draw on energies from within yourself. It's not going to come from your environment. In the end, you will be standing alone, and then what do you do under circumstances like that? One of the things that we do speak about towards the end of this book was that the challenges that face leaders are just incredible. And I mean, whether it is facing the complexity of the technological changes that are going on, the impacts that have on human beings, how we get all excited about the technology, but forget that people are involved, and people could seriously derail all our excitement about technology. A case in point is around Uber, you know. Everybody talks about Uberizing this or that thing, but there's always people involved. How is that going to derail all the starry-eyed stuff that we have about, you know, the technology now is going to make life easier? But a myriad of challenges. And we even say, if you read through the different chapters about the book, even a myriad of competencies that a leader must have, because if you look at the kind of competencies, there are obviously commonalities across the different contexts that we're talking about. So the first thing to say is we're trying to give a reader an insight about what kind of context do leaders play in, and therefore what kind of competencies they require in that particular context. As I say, in some instances it might be common to another context, obviously, but there will also be unique differences in those contexts. But the second thing we're saying is that it's quite likely, just given the rate of change that we are facing, the competencies that people develop now, and inevitably you're sending people off on, say, a 3 or 4 month or 5 month program, or even a year-long program, to go and develop the competency you require for leadership. Just the rate of change that we are faced with means that when you finish that particular program, some of the stuff will already be dated, which means you're always at the edge of having to design and develop new things, how to deal with it. In that particular context, the one point we make towards the end of the book is maybe the most critical skill that a leader will require, given just this very vastly VUCA world that we operate in, the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity and ambiguity, and facing that all the time, maybe the biggest skill that a leader needs to learn is how do you appreciate your situation in that particular moment. In other words, instead of having this big toolkit of competencies that we carry around with us, how are you building your view of how do you respond to this particular challenge that you have now, rather than to try and prepare for all possible challenges that you will face? Because I think the skill with which a leader can then face that particular situation will determine how effective the leader is. That situational appreciation becomes a very important piece, I think, for leaders into the future. And that kind of touch on the issue of what we would call skillful improvisation. But then the question would be, where would a leader learn this kind of skill? It's quite likely that the business schools might catch on to this idea of beginning to move in those spaces. But I think the answer to some extent for me already lie with the artists. Artists actually are very skillful in that regard. And one particular example that we speak about in the book is jazz artists. Jazz artists are great at improvising, to the extent that one jazz band leader spoke of that there is no such thing as a mistake in the jazz band. The only mistake that happens in a jazz band is the inability of a fellow player not responding to the mistake that the other player made. That's the only mistake. So it's not that person's mistake, it's your inability to improvise to make it. So for example, you would never find that you can actually hear that the jazz band has made the mistakes, and they make lots of mistakes. But that's that ability to respond in the moment to the challenge. What a great a commentator in the space of organizational learning said, they are excellent at responding to the back talk of the situation. By the back talk is meant those things for which you can't plan for, they just happen in the moment, and how well are you to think on your feet in responding to it. Is there a world in which leaders could perhaps build such capabilities to respond to their situation in a way that you can appreciate and respond to it effectively? maybe that is the biggest skill that leaders need. But in order to do that, my last point to make means, as I said at the beginning, the leader will have to draw a lot of inner strength rather than outer, which means a lot of the development that needs to happen for leaders will have to be strengthening what is going on inside yourself. Are you aware of what is going on around you? Are you familiar with your own particular blind spots? Are you aware that your belief system impacts how you make sense of the world around you? Are you able to step out of that and say, I will not operate in autopilot. I will bring my own kind of shortcomings to my consciousness so that when I respond to a situation, for example, I don't know everything, which opens you up for what are the possibilities that that situation is presenting you with.
And how can people get a copy of the book?
It can be ordered online from Knowledge Resources. There is an online link on the Knowledge Resources website, kr.co.za. Or you could also look for it in exclusive books. Exclusive books have been exhibiting. It was part of our deadline to get it ready by end of September. Exclusive Books is exhibiting it in most of their stores as far as I know.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Andrew Johnson discussing his co-edited book, Leadership.